Okay, I'm going to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Yukon Extension webinar on food safety titled, Are You Drowning with Questions on Agricultural Water? This is a burning question currently among many, and we hope to provide a better understanding of the updates on the FDA's proposed agricultural water rule. Or not. There you go. Okay. A few housekeeping instructions before we get started. All participants will be muted during this webinar. There will be time for questions and discussion at the end of the meeting. Feel free to use the chat box to ask questions as well. And this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Yukon Extension YouTube channel and also the Food Safety Yukon Extension website. Having said this, let's actually get started. Many of you are here because you are already familiar with the produce safety rule, or you have attended the grower training course offered by Yukon Extension. But for those who are still new to farming or are beginning farmers who might fall under the FDA's rule, we will briefly discuss what the produce safety rule or the PSR stands for, what it states, and how it fits under the FDA's FSMA, that is the Food Safety Modernization Act umbrella. To give you a little bit of background and history, due to numerous outbreaks that were associated with foods, including fresh produce in US, the government decided to be more proactive in developing preventative measures rather than taking action after the outbreak. So the Food Safety Modernization Act with the Tester Amendment was signed in law in January of 2011. In light of many outbreaks being linked to fresh produce itself, the FDA then passed a final rule for the standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. This FDA's rule on fresh produce is nothing but our own, the produce safety rule. Giving you a brief overview, this slide is busy, but on your left, you can see the subparts from the actual final FDA rule, which have all the regulatory requirements. But if you have taken the grower training, then you will recognize on your right how this rule has been broken down into like 7 training modules by the Produce Safety Alliance. This curriculum has been designed by them, and this is what we as trainers use to deliver the training. In this webinar, we will only be focusing on subpart E of the rule, which is for the agricultural water. And we teach it as module 5, part 1 and part 2 in the grower training and the updates related to the rule. Now, once the rule was passed, in 2017, the FDA determined that the compliant states allowed additional 4 years for agricultural water. This is what the initial compliance dates looked like. However, when the initial rule was passed, there were many concerns raised by the farmers and industry stakeholders. The feedback from the farmers suggested that surface water testing requirements were impractical, they were unworkable. Also, they were costly because the cost of testing alone, especially if you have like several sources of surface water, it was not feasible. Labor costs also were a huge challenge. Apart from costs, just the math alone of geometric mean and the standard threshold value, GM, STV could be confusing and complicated. This section was also not very flexible because it was assumed that one size sort of fits all. They did not really take into consideration that water sources may change yearly due to crop rotation or leasing of farmland. And also, consideration should have been given to regional climate differences that affect the water quality. So FDA, to address these questions about the practical implementation of compliance with certain provisions, decided to postpone the compliance dates. Therefore, now there is a proposed agricultural water rule for the subpart E. The main difference here is that the proposed revisions move from testing as the primary metric for decision-making to an agricultural water assessment meant to look at the whole water system. The expectation is that each grower will set their standards and they will understand why those standards are safe. Now, as of March 23rd, FDA is allowing enforcement discretion and will not be enforcing provisions that are related to pre-harvest agricultural water use. This includes microbial water quality profile, MWQP sampling, and associated E. coli standards. Okay, new requirements also have been proposed, and we are expecting that the finalized rule will be released in October 2023. That's the latest that we know from an FDA public statement. But please note that there are no real changes in the requirements for the harvest and post-harvest agricultural water from the initial rule, and that these requirements are now enforceable during inspections, but it depends on the farm size. So we look at the compliance dates in a minute. What are some of the subtopics that are indicative of this new proposed rule? As mentioned earlier, the new rule talks about agricultural water used from production through packing and holding. It requires inspection and maintenance of agricultural water systems. It also addresses the ag water used for sprout irrigation water and harvesting, packing, and holding covered produce. This again relates to use of water with no detectable E. coli as in the previous rule. The proposed rule requires an agricultural water assessment. That is the most important thing about this proposed rule. It also requires you to do annual reassessments for pre-harvest use of ag water. Diane Hirsch will outline the assessment factors that could affect agricultural water and cover these in more detail in the next section, in addition to the new proposed rule. Also, this rule addresses testing as part of an assessment. This new proposed rule outlines use of corrective measures and mitigation measures when risks, hazards are identified during the assessment. These include use of water treatment. Also, the new proposed rule identifies records to be maintained and describes the exemptions to the ag water assessment. Now, while this rule extends the compliance dates for the agricultural water, fresh produce still remains pretty subject to other provisions, say adulteration. So it is very well possible that an inspector could consider a food adulterated or contaminated if there is evidence that the water is unclean or unsanitary, it is contaminated in the field or in the packing facility. So please ensure that you are following the guidelines for good agricultural practices until this rule is finalized. Now, the definitions on these slides are important. They are defined in the rule, and they are critical to understanding the scope of what is covered under this criteria. Ag water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. Agricultural water means water used in covered activities on covered produce, where the water is intended to or is likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. Now, what is covered produce? Covered produce means produce that is subject to the requirements of the produce safety rule. So the term covered produce refers to the harvestable or the harvested part of the crop. Now, water that does not meet this definition of agricultural water is not covered by water quality criteria in the FSMA produce safety rule. For example, if water used for drip or furrow irrigation in apple orchards, that water will not be considered agricultural water as long as the water does not contact the apples. That same water would be considered agricultural water if you are using it to mix protective sprays or pesticide sprays that were then applied directly to the apples. I hope that makes it a little clearer. Now, this slide outlines the compliance dates for subpart E for harvest and post-harvest agricultural water. As I mentioned earlier, the requirements for harvest and post-harvest ag water have not changed from the initial rule. Only the compliance dates have been finalized. For all other businesses with an annual revenue of more than 500K in food, the enforcement date, that is water-related enforcement date, was Jan 2023. So from that date onwards, the inspectors can check for all harvest and post-harvest ag water-related documentations. For small businesses, the enforcement date is Jan 2024, and for very small businesses, it's 2025. Moving to the proposed FDA subpart E compliance dates for pre-harvest agricultural water, the FDA is proposing extended compliance dates, and the proposed dates are 9 months after the effective date of a final rule for all other businesses. So for example, if it's October 2023 that the final rule comes out, 9 months from that day is when all other businesses will need to be compliant. 1 year and 9 months after the effective date of a final rule for small businesses, and 2 years and 9 months after the effective date of a final rule for very small businesses. With this quick regulatory background, let us delve into some examples of what is actually considered as agricultural water. If you have taken the training, you know that we go through this in order for you to understand better how to identify in your operation. Here are some simple steps to arrive at what you would consider as agricultural water. A squash with an overhead irrigation application method, would you consider this as agricultural water? So the first step should be to think about it as if this crop is, if it is a covered produce or not. So if it is a summer squash, then yes, it is a covered produce. If it is a winter squash, then no, it's not. Now, your next step should be to look into if this is a direct application method. Overhead irrigation is a direct application method for the intended crop, that is squash, because it is likely to contact this covered produce. So then finally, is this agricultural water or not? We would say yes for summer squash, but no for the winter squash. Hope this makes things a little clearer. Let's look into a few more examples quickly. Is this agricultural water? The answer would be yes, because in this leafy green with overhead irrigation, the water is intended to or likely to contact covered produce. However, in this scenario, with drip irrigation, the water is not intended to contact covered produce, that is oranges. So that's why it is not considered as agricultural water. So in the event that the drip irrigation is not functioning properly, say you have a broken emitter that sprays water up into the canopy of the tree, the water may contact the crop. But this is not a very likely scenario, especially if you have a good water distribution system, maintained in good condition, properly functioning. Then, because the fruit is a tree above the drip irrigation zone, it would not be considered a hazard. In this example, yes, this agricultural water is, because the pesticide application water that you're using is likely to contact the covered produce. Here, it's an easy answer, no, because potatoes are not covered produce. They are rarely consumed raw. So this overhead irrigation water is not considered agricultural water. And finally, carrots with drip irrigation. The drip irrigation is considered as agricultural water because even though it is drip irrigation, it's a root crop. So the water is going to contact the carrot and might contaminate if not properly maintained or investigated. Okay. As mentioned earlier, in general, a requirement of the subpart E of the FSMA produce safety rule is that all agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. This requirement applies to all agricultural water. It's very important to maintain food safety of fresh produce. So please pay attention to updates in this rule. For the next section, I invite Diane Hirsch to please take over the pre-harvest ag water rule. I forgot to introduce myself, and I just realized midway that I should probably have done that. I am Indu Upadhyaya. I'm the Food Safety Extension Specialist for Yukon Extension. I have Anna here with me, who is my graduate student. We are working on a grant that we received from NIMS USDA on water quality. And this project is also part of that grant. And Diane Hirsch is a retired extension specialist from Yukon Extension. Many of you already know her, and she is helping out with this webinar because this is also part of our produce safety outreach that we conduct in this state. Diane, all yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. You want to advance the slide, Indu? So I'm going to concentrate over the next 20 slides or so, because it is the largest changes you're going to see are in the the pre-harvest water. So even though the rules are still in the state of being proposed, they have not been finalized, it's still a good idea to sort of be aware of what's coming down the road. Both Extension and the Department of Agriculture will continue to keep you updated as this goes forward and we learn more about when the final rule will be published. And at that point, if there are any changes that have occurred in the final rule from the proposed rule, then of course we will update you on that. Okay, next slide. This is just that same slide with the compliance dates, again, emphasizing the fact that the compliant dates for pre-harvest water have not been finalized because the rule hasn't been finalized. And so 9 months after the effective date for the largest companies, which would be July of 2024 at this point, if they come out with the rule in October. So you see, you have a lot of time. You have a winter to sort of pay attention to some of this. And I was thinking as I came up with that July date that you might even have a few months where you're harvesting certain products that wouldn't yet be coming under the rule. So you could sort of practice, you know, have a little chance to work out some of the bugs, so to speak, as you go through this program. And then small businesses, 1 year and 9 months. So that would be July of 25. And the very small businesses have till 26. So you have a lot of time to work on this, depending on the size of your operation. Next slide. So with the proposed rule, FDA is amending the produce safety regulation in a way that addresses concerns about the practical challenges of using the ag water microbial quality criteria that we present in the curriculum, and any of those testing requirements that were part of the initial rule. Instead, there's a requirement for a pre-harvest agricultural water assessment that covered farms will use to help them identify what measures they need to take to ensure that the water they use is of safe and adequate sanitary quality. They also have proposed corrective measures or mitigation measures, and we'll go over those. They're sort of new and a little different from the previous rule. If risks are identified during the assessment, these measures will be used to address these risks or reasonably likely hazards in your ag water systems. Next slide. So the proposed rule outlines the steps that are to be implemented by covered farms to address the safety and quality of their pre-harvest ag water. So I'm going to go through each one of these over the next couple of slides. Next slide. So the first and probably most impactful piece of this rule is the ag water assessment. And it's sort of called ag, I don't know if they call it agwa, but that's how you might see it written down, ag, capital W, capital A. And these are the factors that they want you to consider as you conduct your ag water assessment. It identifies, the protocol identifies 5 factors that farmers must consider as they conduct their initial and annual assessments. And they're listed here: the ag water system that you use, the practices that you use, the characteristics of your crop, what environmental conditions might impact your water quality, and other factors. We're going to go through each one of these now. Next. So a farm water system starts at the source, which could be pond, river, well, or municipal sources, and continues through the distribution mechanism, piping or canals, to the application methods where you might be using that water via hoses or sprinklers or whatever. The entire system must be considered during the assessment. What are the sources? What's the nature of the source? Where is the source located? As we know, different sources have different levels of risk associated with them on a continuum from surface sources, which have the highest risk due to the variability due to the environment, the climate, any kind of animal influence or land use influences, to well water, and then to public water sources, which are the least risky. What kind of distribution system are you using to transport that water? Are there risks associated with that? You may be using a drip system, but what happens if there's a leak? Closed piping systems, even though they're fairly well protected, unlike open canals, for example, do have some risks. Do you have adequate backflow prevention devices? It could happen that if the backflow prevention devices are not sufficient, chemicals or otherwise contaminated water that you're using could actually flow backwards into your water source. So if there's a change in water pressure, for example. So you need to pay attention to your entire water system, how the connections are made, etc. What are some possible sources of contamination? Consider both adjacent land, such as land and operations that might be sharing a border with you, or nearby animal facilities or manure storage facilities. There may be something down the road a ways, but because of the way that they store their manure, it's conceivable that on a hot, dry, windy day, some of that may be blown into your area. So you just have to be aware. Obviously, you don't have a lot of control over that, but you need to be aware if there are risks to nearby, from nearby land facilities. What about wildlife? What about other users of your water source if you share a water source with others? What can you do to protect your water source? What do you have control over? You may not have much control over the source of your water. And what do you not have control over, and what can you do about it? These are all things to consider as you're doing your assessment. Next slide. When assessing, you want to review the type of application method you're using, whether it's overhead, drip, or other methods. Some parts of the country might use things like flood irrigation or furrow irrigation. How is the location of the harvestable portion of the crop impacted by the type of application you're using? There may be concerns for splash on leafy greens, or what happens if you are using drip on root crops. That actually is a direct application of agricultural water. Root crops that are going to be eaten raw, that is. Consider the time interval between the last time ag water is applied and the harvest date. We'll talk a little bit more about the time intervals because They are addressed a little differently in this rule now that testing is no longer required. So we'll talk about how they use that in this new proposed rule. Next slide. So think about your crops and their characteristics. You need to know, and this is something we have said over and over again in the course, you need to know and understand the food safety concerns and the risks for each crop you grow, because they're all different. Do your research. Are the surface characteristics an issue? We know that with cantaloupe, the rough surface makes it able to hold on to microbes that maybe something with a more smooth surface, like a honeydew melon, might not have. It might increase surface adhesion. Is your crop susceptible to internalization during production? Now, we're not talking internalization, which we discussed in the course during washing or in a dunk tank. We're talking about what might happen in the field here. So this can happen when there might be damage to a product. Let's say there's been a hailstorm and it has bruised a product or cut a product. That might be the source where bacteria can actually get into your product. There have been some studies that suggest that possibly there might be some uptake from the soil of certain pathogens on certain products, such as leafy greens. So you need to, again, be aware of your product and what are the risks as you grow these products in the field. Where is the edible portion of your crop? Is it close to the ground? Is it in the ground? Or is it in the air? And how does that potentially impact contamination that might occur in the field? Next slide. Climate can also have a variety of effects, and this is really one of the reasons that this whole rule revision came about, is because of different climate effects in different regions of the country, and not everyone having the same concerns. But for an example, some pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli are more likely to decrease in increasing temperatures. The same is true of their survival in water. The warmer the water is, you may have a destruction of those bacteria and they may not survive. Airborne transmission of pathogens is likely to increase with windy or dry conditions like we have today, for example. And heavy rain events have been associated with increased populations of pathogens. When you consider what happens every time there's a really heavy rainstorm, and many swimming facilities have to be shut down to high levels of E. coli. And this can happen with surface water sources as well. So the point here is not necessarily to predict the weather for the year ahead, but to be aware of the surroundings, be aware of weather changes and how they impact and increase or decrease the risk that pathogens may be spread, they may survive, or they may actually decrease in levels should these weather events occur. So be aware of the trends, day-to-day changes that can help you assess the risks and the safety of your water sources. Next slide. The rule primarily addresses here, when they talk about other factors, they really don't give any examples of other factors. I think they sort of want to leave open here with some ambiguity that there may be things that come up over time that are thought to have an impact on the risk of your water source. So if you know of something, farmers know their operations best, that might be impacting potentially the safety of their water source, and they need to consider that as part of their assessment. They also, in this section, speak to the fact that if you decide you want to continue to conduct testing to help inform the assessment, you can certainly do that. While it's not a requirement, If you do it, then you need to include it in your assessment and keep records of the testing that you're doing. Next slide. So another thing that is discussed in the rule is once you have done your assessment and you have made some determinations about the safety and quality of your water, then there are things that you need to do if, in fact, there are problems that you identify. So under the proposed rule, covered farms would use the information generated by the assessment to identify hazards that increase the risk that your water source is compromised and ultimately compromising the safety of the crops you grow. If as a result of the water assessment, you determine or have reason to believe that your water is not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, then you have to immediately discontinue its use and take corrective measures before using it prior to harvest. Next slide. So there's a couple of examples of corrective measures. Now they use, again, two different terms in this rule. They use corrective measures and mitigation measures. And one of the handouts that's available in the link at the end of the talk today, and will be put into chat ultimately, describes, it basically gives if and then. If this happens, then you need to use these corrective measures. If this happens, then you need to use mitigation measures. So we're going to go over those in the next couple of slides. So if you determine that your water is just not safe or adequate for its use, these are the two corrective measures that have been identified. One is to re-inspect your entire system and make any changes needed to address the quality issues. And the example they use is if there's a dead or decaying livestock in your surface water source, then obviously that water source is not safe and sanitary for use. So you need to do what you need to do to fix that. Or another option would be to treat water according to the rule, which is found in section 112.46. Basically, if you're using chemicals, they must be EPA approved and comply with any EPA regulations with regards to mixing and distributing, etc. And they can have no negative environmental impact on wildlife or plant life. So any treatment you use must also not just be safe, but must consistently yield the safe water source results that you need to have it yield. So the only way you know if that's actually happening is to monitor it on a regular basis to make sure that consistent effectiveness to ensure it's adequate for use. Next slide. So there are a couple of more outcomes that they identify in the rule. This provision of the proposed rule addresses the fact that a number of recent outbreaks cited in the preamble of the rule have been associated with animal activity or biological soil amendments of animal origin, or BSAAOs, or human waste. So if one of the risks that you're identifying have to do with any of these hazards, animal poop, or human waste, then you must mitigate the risk and implement mitigation measures no later than the same growing season. So they're not telling you here that you have to stop the use of the water and then do corrective actions, but you have to use mitigation measures this right now as you're completing this season. Next slide. The other type of outcome that mitigation measures are needed for are any kind of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards not related to animal activity, BSAAOs, or human waste. And then you would also implement mitigation measures, but you have till the following year, no later than the following year to do that. I'm having kind of a hard time finding any documentation of what they mean by risks that are not related to animal activity or human waste or BSAAOs, since most of the risks that we address in surface water or in agricultural water are animal related. So I tried to come up with maybe a couple, and they may be the fact that there was a heavy rain or there was a broken emitter. So those are not directly animal activity hazards, but they are hazards that you should address with mitigation. So the next slide speaks to what these mitigation measures are that they're talking about. These are outlined in the proposed rule, and they include making any changes to the distribution system and or repairs. That's really no different than the corrective measure, that you're going to go back, look at your system, see if there's any problems. Is your well cap broken, or is there a leak in your piping from your water source? What are the things that that might be a problem in your system? You might consider changing your water application methods and go from using drip rather than overhead, for example. Or you might consider treating the water. And again, you need to use safe and effective methods that are outlined in the rule and compliant with EPA. Next. Some additional mitigation factors. Here we're going to go back and revisit the use of time intervals, which were part of the original rule. In the original rule, they were a way to address water that tested outside the safe standards identified in subpart E. Now, using time intervals is a mitigation method to use when risks are identified. You still do not have to test. That is not a requirement, but you can use a 4-day interval between the time of direct water application and harvest. If you read, this is terribly boring reading sometimes, but if you go and download the whole proposed rule and read through the preamble, the rule itself is only about 4 pages long. The preamble is about 25 pages long. But in that, they discuss a lot of how they came to some of these decisions, one of which being that the time interval would be 4 days. When we used the guidelines from the previous rule, 4 days was the maximum amount of time that you could use as a time interval. So if you did all the math and you found out that your water would not get to the proper safety level until 6 days, you couldn't use that water. So they have decided to use this 4 days as their guidance, and have done, I guess, sufficient research to determine that it's sufficient amount of time for the most part. So if you want to test, and if you still continue to do your testing, let's say you have to do it for a third-party auditor, or you have just decided, you really want to know the actual information about your water source, you can still do the calculations. And if you come up with a 2-day time interval rather than 4 days, and you like that better, you want to be able to harvest sooner, then you can certainly use that 2-day harvest window instead of the 4. But you would have to document that you have the testing done and documented to support that decision that you're going to use only 2 days. Now, there's a few other there are other alternative measures that you can use as mitigation measures. There has been some discussion about using the time interval between harvest and selling. So the amount of time that's spent, in the packing house before the product goes out the door, and also using commercial washing to help reduce pathogens. At the present time, they don't really have any data to support these two options because they feel that there's too much variation in storage facilities and packing house procedures, etc. How much microbial load comes in on a product. So how much, what does the washing really do, and how does that reduce microbes? So at the point they're making here is they're giving you flexibility that if you can support with documented science an alternative measure, then you can certainly use it. Next slide. So if you do your assessment and you don't find any likely hazards, lucky you. That's all you need to do. However, you do still need to, just like everyone does, do an annual reassessment. So even if you don't have to make any changes the first time around, you still have to do this reassessment every year because things change, climates change, equipment changes. The other thing to keep in mind is if you make any changes in your system midstream, let's say you have a new piece of equipment you want to put into your system, or you want to use a different sanitizer, if you had a backflow breach, any kind of change that occurs that might affect your whole system, then you need to do a reassessment right then and not just wait to the annual one. You need to do it as you're making these changes. This is something that in all the food safety programs are necessary. If any, food processor gets a new piece of equipment, they have to do a new hazard analysis right then and there and not wait till their annual. Okay, next. In terms of records, we kind of talked about this. You will need a written record of your ag water assessment. Generally speaking, we say that activities generate records. So you have done this assessment. You need to generate a record, a documentation that this was done. And in this record, you have to include what you evaluated, what risks you identified, and how those risks are being addressed. And certainly if you do any testing, that would also be included in any records that you must keep. Next slide. Ta-da, there are exemptions. So basically, some of you who have been farming a while probably pretty much can figure this out. If you are using water that meets the requirements for harvest and post-harvest water, then you are exempted from doing an ag water assessment. That means that if you're using tested well water or public water, then you do not have to do the ag water assessment. You still have to do the inspection of your system and maintenance of your system, but you don't have to conduct and document an ag water assessment. You just have to prove that you have a water source that fits into these categories. Next slide. So what should you do now? Because as we know, this is all still up in the air. Basically, we think that you should just, if you're already testing, continue to test. If nothing else, these tests, and that's not to say you have to do the 20 tests or the 5 tests, but tests can also can always be useful in informing you about the quality of your water. And as you're doing your assessment, a history of testing could help with that. Follow good agricultural practices to protect and maintain your water quality. Some buyers or third-party auditors may still require certain things, including testing, that you will not necessarily have to do. But obviously, if you're using those folks or if your customer wants it, you're still going to have to do it. The proposed Subpart E requirements emphasize the use of the ag water assessment to assess the entire system. So you might want to start looking at some of these documents that they have, including an ag water assessment builder, which is a link that is at the end of this presentation. put out by FDA, and it's available in two formats. You can download the PDF and actually have the paper copy, or you can actually conduct your assessment online. I know that makes a lot of people squeamish, but you can do it either way. I looked over the tool and I think it could be very helpful. It is long, 33 pages, but not every farm will have to do everything that's in that assessment. And finally, just continue doing what you're doing, inspecting your water systems and making sure that they are safe and adequate for their use. Okay. Take it away, Indu.
Thank you, Diane. Now let's move on to the FDA Ag Water Subpart E water rule on harvest and post-harvest water. We have discussed this slide earlier. What it indicates is that this rule for harvest and post-harvest ag water is actively reinforced now for all other businesses for whom the compliance date was in Jan 2023, small businesses 2024, and very small businesses, it's going to be in 2025. Now, how is harvest and post-harvest water different from water used during growing activities, which Diane has just covered? Now, this water is used in harvesting, packing, and holding activities, and it also includes water used for washing or cooling harvested produce, or for making ice, or even water that is intended to prevent dehydration. As indicated in the introduction, the requirements for harvest and post-harvest water in Subpart E and related provisions in Subpart N and O remain the same. These include that quality standards are being maintained, inspections and maintenance are being carried out, treatment of water is being done. If it is being done, then it is being monitored. The microbial quality criterion measures are being taken, testing requirements are being fulfilled, who is testing, and if these waters have additional management and monitoring going on, and any records related to any of these activities are being kept. So this is very similar to what we have been teaching so far in the grower training, and also what the rule suggests, the initial rule suggested. For post-harvest water management, there are two main things that growers will need to understand and manage: the water quality at the start of use, and the water management strategies such as water treatments used to reduce cross-contamination risks that can be because of water. It should also is from a source, which is a public water system. This public water system should meet a certain requirement that is highlighted in the rule, and most of the municipal water systems meet that requirement. Also, testing is not required if the source is from a public water supply that meets the microbial criteria of no detectable generic E. coli per 100 ml of water, or if that public water system has been treated in accordance with the requirements in the final rule. Say it's been chlorinated or UV sterilized, or one of the methods that is there in the rule has been applied. However, testing is required if you're using untreated groundwater during or after harvest, and we'll talk about it in a minute. For harvest and post-harvest activities, the water used must not have any detectable generic E. coli. This requirement has not changed from the initial rule. The water could come directly in contact with covered produce during or after harvest. It could come directly in contact with food contact surfaces, or even the water that is used to make ice or used for hand washing. That water also needs to follow the standard. Untreated surface water must not be used for these purposes. It should never be used because it's unsafe. You can treat the surface water like rainwater or pond water. You can treat it and ensure that it has no detectable generic E. coli. and can be used for harvest activities. Just make sure that you keep the records that demonstrate that the zero detectable limit of E. coli in this water. And now I would like to take a minute to talk about sanitizers, because they are generally considered to be like part of a broader group, the antimicrobial pesticides. And these can be used for antimicrobial treatments. The label will describe if it is an approved use or not, such as like for water or for food contact surfaces. EPA regulates this and registers the antimicrobial and chemical pesticides. So you can use approved sanitizers to treat the water, but one misconception is that the sanitizers are added to the water to wash the produce, but actually the sanitizers are used to prevent the spread of contamination via water. So that is an important clarification here. The treatments of water that contact the produce, this could include the use of sanitizers, but it must be registered for that use, that particular sanitizer. Registration information should be there on the label. In some cases, like the label information will come along with the paperwork, like safety data sheets and things like that would be there with the sanitizer itself. And the grower could need to find out more additional information, which they can find out from the manufacturer. But just make sure that you're always following the label, because the label is the law. There are many different kinds of sanitizers that are available, especially like even organic options, if any of you are organic farmers. And this list of EPA approved sanitizer is available at the PSA website, and the link for that also will be provided at the end of the webinar and be put in chat as well. But make sure that any antimicrobial product that you're using must be labeled for use with fruits and vegetables. Okay. There is a chat. I just want to make sure it's not. You all can hear me, that is? Okay. Here are some of the testing requirements for untreated groundwater and public water supply sources used for post-harvest use. For untreated groundwater, you need to test initially 4 or more times during the growing season, or 4 times over the period of a year, and then after test 1 or more times per year after the initial year. If your source is like a public water supply, then you need to keep the copy of the test results or the current certificates of compliance to be presented to the inspectors, because the inspectors will expect that all farms, regardless of compliance dates, are familiar with what their water source is, and they are required to provide proof and assurance that the produce that they are selling to consumers is not adulterated. Now, if you're using single pass water, this water also must not have detectable generic E. coli. Although like the FSMA produce safety rule does not require water treatment, the reason why I'm mentioning this for single pass or the recirculated and batch water is that water at every stage of post-harvest wash until like the fresh produce leaves your facility must be safe and deemed acceptable for use. So that's why it's important that the single pass water have no detectable E. coli. The recirculated and batch water also must not have any detectable E. coli, especially in the beginning of use. You need to have documentation for that. It's important that you maintain safe and adequate sanitary quality. It is best that you must establish like a schedule for changing the batch water, or some sort of process is there in place for minimizing the buildup of organic material. You could use sanitizer to maintain that, although, as I mentioned, treatment is not required, but can be used to maintain the water quality and reduce cross-contamination risks, especially if you're seeing an issue. Having said that, sanitizers are not the only option to ensure best post-harvest water quality. If you are adding antimicrobials or sanitizers, then make sure you're monitoring and adding the product appropriately. You're monitoring and modifying pH as required. or as is requested in the label, that you're monitoring the water and temperatures, the turbidity, especially in dump tanks, and you're changing and adding water as needed. Also, make sure that you are calibrating the thermometers and sensors because they are your primary monitoring devices. So make sure everything is working and that you are keeping up to date on all your equipment as well. If during monitoring you do come across some issues, then what are the corrective actions that you can take? Say you come across improper procedures that indicate that water sanitation is not working, then you need to take corrective action. This could be because of antimicrobial treatment is very low or ineffective, or like the sanitizer inventory is going too fast, or the pH readings are not in the proper range, or any other such issues, then corrective actions will be required. If your workers are reporting some problem with monitoring activities or turbidity or post-harvest wash, corrective actions are required. If as a supervisor, you see that record-keeping sheets, monitoring is not taking place properly or not in an effective manner, or is not correct, then again, you need to take corrective actions, which could be retraining your workers or replacing defective devices. So the corrective actions should be taken. They really need to be taken as per what you encounter in your operation. Now, record keeping is not anyone's favorite, but it is very, 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 very important. It helps document all water management activities. These could be water quality tests or antimicrobial product use, or just basic monitoring of your devices and corrective actions. All of these records are required, and the inspectors will come and ask you for those. Record keeping also allows you to manage and properly monitor the practices. These are that everything is being done properly, everything's working properly. Record keeping can also help you with identifying patterns or some trends that say that maybe this is not your best practice and you need to change that or improve upon it to ensure safe food. Now, the records that are required by the rule are same as before. These include, currently they would include your assessment or findings of harvest or post-harvest ag water system inspections, any analytical test results that you have, documentations from the public water systems, such as, say, certificate of compliance, or if you have taken corrective actions and documentations of that. If you're following a procedure which has been scientifically validated, then keep that document as well to justify your treatment parameters, especially if they're different from what has been traditionally followed. Also, if you are using any other analytical methods outlined in the rule, then please keep documentations of those as well. Finally, what we would like you to take away from this webinar is that according to the new proposed rule for pre-harvest water, assessment is required. You need to identify the risks, take mitigative and corrective measures, and then reassess your water systems. Treating water is an option that is available, but make sure you keep copies of your treatments, copies of all the water test results, and document all water management practices. For post-harvest water, as in the initial rule, make sure you're inspecting and testing your water. It's best to develop standard operating procedures. We have not discussed them a lot here, but SOPs are very beneficial to manage your steps and to ensure that everything is regularly being taken care of. Monitor key water management steps, monitor key variables of both the water and any sanitizer used to ensure post-harvest water quality, and take corrective actions when you see a problem or as and when needed, and keep detailed records required in the rule. Okay, Here are some important links that we talked about. They will appear in your chat stream. Anna, if you can put these links, please. The first one is a link to the proposed rule itself. The second and third are like fact sheets that are generated by FDA to provide some basic information regarding the ag water assessments. The fourth is the link to the FDA ag water tool. And there are two options you can use. You can either download a PDF and give a paper version, or you can complete it online and download it for your personal use. The final link, which I think this is not in this slide, but I have it in my section, which I will upload now. It is a PSA labeled sanitizers for produce. You can download it as an Excel sheet. So I will add that in the chat box. With that, I know we have covered a lot of, especially in the ag water rule in the given limited time. The Federal Register has a lot of regulations with subparts, and we hope that we have been able to cover most of it. Things are still vague. I know you guys still have questions. So with that, thank you for your time, and we're happy to take those questions now. Okay, all right. You can put the questions in the chat, or I think we can probably unmute you to ask questions. So maybe you can unmute yourself if you have questions. Please feel free to do that.
I think they're all overwhelmed.
We were overwhelmed when we read the rule, or when the rule was proposed. It is understandably so.
I don't know, does Mackenzie have anything to add with regards to how the Department of Ag is addressing this?
Yes, Mackenzie White and I think Melissa also, I saw, they are from the Department of Ag, and they can answer questions if required on inspections or state regulations. We are glad that they're here. Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Yeah, no, thank you for putting on this webinar first and foremost, because it's very informational and educational for all of us, including us regulators, since we're kind of still just grasping it all and understanding it all. But yeah, as of right now, I mean, we've like been out to a couple other farms and just keep on recommending the whole, just keep testing if that's working for you, because the assessment portion of it can kind of be overwhelming, of course, but basically you hit everything, like the nail on the head with it all, and we are agreeing with everything that you're saying at this time too. So, and I mean, and if folks have questions, I mean, let us know. I mean, at DOAG, I mean, we can help answer those as well, the best we can.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Either everybody understood everything, or we put them to a very nice sleep. I'm just waiting to put a link. Here's the link for the label sanitizers for produce. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you for joining us for this webinar. The recording will be posted on the Yukon Extension YouTube channel and also on the food safety website. With that, thank you all, and have a very wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thank you. Thanks, Mackenzie. I'm gonna stop recording here.